Well, all right, everybody. Welcome. Welcome. Happy Pi, that's 3.14 approximation day. I know you it's on your calendar. It's also Lasagna Awareness Month. And if you weren't aware of lasagna before, woo, you are in for a treat and you have been warned. Welcome to Skeptical Inquirer Presents. This is a series of live online presentations from experts who are devoted to advancing science over pseudoscience, media literacy over conspiracy theories, and critical thinking over magical thinking. Woohoo! This is the spot. My name is Leanne Lord, and I am delighted to be your host. I am a stand up comedian and author. I also, on occasion, co host Point of Inquiry, the podcast for the Center for Inquiry. And if you are so inclined, you can find out more about me and my work at veryfunnylady.com. Now, as usual, I have a couple of reminders. The Coronavirus Resource Center is the place to get your inoculation against misinformation. This week, there's an article about the coming of booster shots. Nature follows the science on whether or not children should get the COVID vaccine. And The Hill covers the Twilight Zone moment of Sean Hannity saying out loud, quote, I believe in the science of vaccination. Well, clutch the pearls and welcome to the party, sir. Listen, if you're interested in good information, and I know you are because you're here, might I suggest you get a subscription to Skeptical Inquirer magazine? You can do digital or print, but word to the wise, the print subscription gives you access to the digital subscription as well. More bang for your intellectual buck, so to speak. So you can get either or both at skepticalinquirer.org. And FYI, the next Skeptical Inquirer Presents is on July 22nd. I can't believe we're midway through the year already. Mike Rothschild, that's the author, he's the author of The Storm is Upon Us, will explain the background of the conspiracies and cults that fed the Q phenomenon. Now, if you're new here, and if you are, welcome. Thank you for joining us. Here's the deal: the flow of the evening is really easy. You keep doing whatever you're doing. I'll introduce our esteemed guest. They'll razzle and dazzle you. And after that, we'll have a little time to open it up for your questions. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see there's an icon that says Q&A, and that's the place for you to type your questions in the form of a question, if you please. And if you miss anything of the talk tonight, it is being recorded and will be available on skepticalinquirer.org. And now, our guest is a behavioral scientist, teacher, and writer. He is a contributing editor for Skeptical Inquirer magazine, the one I just mentioned. You should get that subscription to. He writes the Behavior and Belief column. The first edition of his book, Believing in Magic, The Psychology of Superstition, won the William James Book Award of the American Psychological Association. Whew, I want to get that right. And was translated into Japanese, German, and Romulan. I mean Romanian. Although Romulan would be cool too, I guess. But Vulcan first, because, I mean, come on, let's be serious. Anyway, I'm sorry. His latest book, Superstition, a very short introduction, was published in 2020. I know, the year that shall not be spoken, and I just spoke it. But he was doing stuff in 2020, which is the point. And as an expert on superstition and irrational behavior, our guest has been quoted in many news outlets, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times. I mean, he has appeared on several many television shows, including CBS Sunday Morning, CNN International, and the PBS NewsHour. And NPR's Science Friday. He holds a PhD in psychology, a BA and MA degrees in English literature, and is a fellow of the Association for Psychological Science and the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry. And so, after all of that wind up, everybody, I am so excited. I told my black cat about this. He's in the corner listening as well. Here to give us the full story about superstition. Please welcome Stuart Vyse. Stuart, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Leanne. It's great to be here and nice to be with you, even if it's only across these screens.
Mhm.
And so Thank you. That was a great introduction. I feel very impressed with myself at the moment. So let's get started right away. Okay, let's see if this is going to work. Oh, let's try that one more time. Okay, there we go. So I thought I would start with, just to show that I'm very hip with an internet meme, how it started and how it's going. And it started years ago, thousands of years ago, with people trying to tell the future with yarrow sticks as using the I Ching. I'll say a little bit more about that before, but this goes back at least to 1000 BCE. And then more recently, it turns out that ginger root and meteorite dust are cures for COVID. We know this isn't really true, but if you have any meteorite dust, I'd really like to see it just for fun. So this is sort of a metaphor for the theme of the talk. It's, we have still got a lot of work to do, it turns out. How it started for me, as Leanne mentioned, I did publish this book in 1997, Believing in Magic, the Psychology of Superstition. And it took me about 6 years to write it. So I realized just as I was putting this together that I think I've been doing this superstition thing now for 30 years, which means I must be rather old. This is the updated edition, which came out in 2014. I like this cover much better than the other one. It seems appropriate. And so anyway, this is out now in paperback and I think it's reasonably good. Since 2016, as Leanne mentioned, I have been writing for Skeptical Inquirer, and I just wanted to say that it has been a great joy for me to do so. I did the whole academic thing, writing, publishing peer-reviewed papers and so on, as you have to do when you're a professor. And I still do that from time to time, but I really love writing for the general audience, communicating science to people who are not necessarily scientists, and being able to write for Skeptical Inquirer has been a great thing for me to have that platform and to be able to do it. So I plan on continuing as long as they let me. I also just happen to love that kid on this particular cover of the magazine, so that's why I chose him. And as Leanne mentioned, I did publish this book in March of 2020. It came out at just the wrong moment. I had a book tour planned for England, and it had to be canceled naturally. I'm not complaining. Other people had much worse problems than that, but nonetheless, it's a part of the very short introduction series that Oxford University Press has. It's a little pocket book, very thin, and they have these introductions on all sorts of topics. I really recommend the series. And this book is something like the 630th one in the series. It's everything you can think of, including superstition. There's a short introduction to it. At the beginning of the pandemic, I bought the one on viruses. Anyway, the overview of that book is sort of the overview of this talk with some variation. The book talks about the history of the word superstition, and superstition is a sort of negative label. Obviously, it's not something you don't walk up to someone on the street and say, "Hi, my name is Stuart Vyse. I'm superstitious." You don't lead with that. It's not something you brag about. Quite the contrary. And so it has had that kind of effect as a word throughout history, but in very different ways over time. I will talk a little bit about origins and some popular superstitions, as well as the psychology of superstition. Oh yeah, the book was recently reviewed in Skeptical Inquirer magazine by William London. I was surprised and delighted to see a very thorough review. And you'd think that if it was reviewed in your own magazine, the same magazine you write for, that it would end up being a puff piece. But we're skeptics here. So Bill's article is quite thorough, and he has some bones to pick, and I think that's wonderful, and I look forward to being able to discuss it with him sometime at PsyCon or some other conference. Okay, well, no, it's not really going to be the full story. I can't do that in the short time that we have. But the point of it is that I am going to give you a broad overview. I am a psychologist, and I entered into this studying the psychology of superstition, but I'm going to try to give you a broader picture today. And so what I will talk about is some of the historical background for superstition, some of my favorite superstitions, and also something about psychology, and I'll have some words at the end as well to sum it up. So at the beginning, the world was very uncertain. If you've ever tried to imagine what it would be like to be a person in the ancient world, pre-scientific world, it must have been a very frightening place. You know, people didn't understand the weather, and yet the weather was really important, of course. They had very little understanding that was reliable about health and medicine. All sorts of calamitous things can happen. Life expectancies were very short. And so the world was a scary place. And so from the very beginning of time, people have tried to figure out what was going on and to foretell the future and so on. And so there were, even more so, much more so than today, there were itinerant people who were fortune tellers, engaged in divination, had magic that they claimed that they could do. And this was like a pretty good job opportunity for many people, although I don't think anybody got very rich doing it. These people who were sort of street level magicians and soothsayers were always criticized by the elites, almost always criticized by the elites, and not thought to be of high status. But they were there, and I put the Epic of Gilgamesh there. This is a tablet from the Epic of Gilgamesh that that is, of course, held by the British Museum. They have all the stuff, and this is thought to be, this is an epic story that was found, of course, goes back to the Babylonian era, and was found on, it's spread across 12 different tablets. This is just a piece of a tablet. And the story it tells goes back to 2000 BCE, right? 4,000 years ago. So that means that, you know, it's quite old, and it is considered to be the oldest work of literature known at the moment. And anyway, it's a long story about how it was found and discovered, but nonetheless, in the story, at several points, the hero goes to sleep, and he often is wanting a dream to come to him. And of course, he wakes up, and like all of us, he can't figure out what the dream means or what it is. And someone, either his mother or a friend, interprets the dream for him, and it's always foretelling something about his future. So you can see that pretty much as long as there's been human history, people have wanted to be able to foretell the future and have some predictability in their lives. So understandable, at least in the goal, if not the methods. They didn't have the methods. I also wanted to point out something interesting, at least it's interesting to me, about these methods of foretelling the future, fortune telling, divination, and so forth. Many of them involved random processes. So for example, augury, when we say something doesn't augur well, that's referring to the activity of augury, which was a way of foretelling the future by watching the random flight of birds in the sky. It was also done with herds of horses running loose. Of course, the yarrow sticks are a random process. They were tossed, and the way they fell determined something. And casting of lots, the early dice, lotteries, and so forth, much of the purpose of that was also to foretell the future. And more recently, you know, tea leaves in the bottom of your teacup, or tarot cards, which again are a random process. I just think it's sort of noteworthy that the world was random and uncontrollable. And so these methods of trying to foretell the future were in fact symbolic of the larger project of, you know, here's a random thing. Can we get some secret out of it that will give us meaning for the world at large? And of course, you know, it hasn't gone away. I took this picture about 4 miles from where I'm sitting now. The next town over is Mystic, Connecticut. And there are fortune tellers there trying to make some money at it too. So nowhere near the number that there were in the ancient world, but it's still around, as you know. But I'm getting way ahead of myself. Let's go back. And I just wanted to say again that the history of superstition is in a way the history of an epithet, the history of a negative label that was always applied to somebody else, not to yourself. And so what is interesting about it is how that the object of that attack changed over time. And it begins, the concept of superstition that we know of begins with the Greek word desedaimonia, which in the 4th century BCE actually was a positive term, and it meant that you were conscientiously religious. You did the things that you were supposed to do. You made the sacrifices to the gods. You prayed as you were supposed to. You followed the feast days and so forth. And it was a good thing. But within just 100 years, it had turned to its first negative connotation, and that is that you're overly fearful of the gods. And of course, in the Greek world, you're not supposed to be overly anything. You're supposed to be moderate. Excessive things are not a good thing. And it also was sort of an insult to the gods. The gods were crazy. They did wild things, but they were generally not thought to be something that you should fear. They were generally benevolent. The Romans took that same concept and applied their own word to it, which was superstitio. And obviously that's where our word comes from. And it had exactly the same two meanings. At first it was, appropriately religious, and then it was overly fearful of, in this case, the Roman gods. It also got to be applied, as we will see in a minute, to all those street level magicians, those people who claim to have powers that the gods, were supposed to have, and so on, were called superstitious or superstitio. So here's a really rapid overview of the entire history of the word. I'm going to go back into a couple of these, but as I said, it started out as being good religion. This is my little sort of nomenclature, but it started out as good religion, then excessive religion, which isn't good, and then bad religion, right? Magic and divination were unauthorized, unaccepted forms of religion. Then, as the Roman world got more extensive and dominant, the word was applied to other religions that were thought to be superstitious in relation to the gods and so forth that the Romans worshipped. So Jews and Christians both at various times were considered superstitious, and their activities were considered superstitious. But watch out what you what you say. As they say, what goes around comes around. Eventually, the Roman Empire became a Christian empire, and suddenly the arrow of criticism went in the opposite direction. And so anyone who continued to worship the Roman gods was now superstitious. And some people did, and it was hard to give up the old system, and so that was a different kind of bad religion, meaning non-Christian religion at that point, and that would continue on in various forms for a long time until finally the Enlightenment comes, science starts to blossom, and eventually we get the definition of superstition that we have today, which is bad science, no longer bad religion, but bad science, things that are unscientific. So that's the rapid overview of the history. And I'm going to stop at a couple of points to mention a few things. I apologize if you've seen any of my other talks recently, because I almost always talk about this thing because it just is one of my favorite things. It would be considered by us a superstition of the ancient world. So it was done by Greeks, Romans, and a number of people in the Mediterranean area. So this is a curse tablet, and this one too is in the property of the British Museum, and it's a flat piece of lead. And so it was a common thing to believe that curses were real in those days, and anybody could cast a curse if they wanted to. And so why would you want to curse somebody? It turns out we know there were about 1,000 of these curse tablets that have been found throughout the Mediterranean. And we find that there are a number of categories of why people cursed other people in those days. Some of them were legal curses. And what meant by that is that people had to defend themselves in court if they got into trouble or if they had a gripe with someone else. And so how you spoke in court, if you were a very good orator, you might win the day on that day. If you spoke poorly, you might not. And so, so you might, if you were in a dispute with somebody and you were both going to appear in court, you might cast a curse against your opponent so that they wouldn't speak well on that day, and that would give you an advantage. And this was so widely known and widely believed that if somebody who was known to have been a good orator had a bad day in court and didn't speak that well, it was assumed that he had been cursed, and that was the reason why. There were lots of competitions in the Greek world, theater competitions between different players, and also athletic competitions. And so it was not uncommon for a fan of one or the other competitor to take out a curse on the competition. So this would be sort of like, us taking out a curse on the Yankees pitcher, if you're a Red Sox fan, or vice versa, depending upon. One of the more interesting categories, and there were a lot of these, were love curses, where you might have a longing for your neighbor's spouse, right? But he or she is not available to you for obvious reasons. So you might take out a curse in which you would ask something bad happen to your rival, and that the person you desire would have only eyes for you. And these were very complicated curses that were written out on these plants, and that was very common. Undoubtedly, they didn't work, but I think it's a really interesting phenomenon for a couple of reasons. So, first of all, let me just explain how it worked. You would probably go to a vendor who would do this, a magician who would help you with this. A lot of people weren't literate, so they wouldn't be able to write out the curse. And you may not be able to see it, but there is written words on this piece of lead scratched in with some kind of a stylus. The ones that have been found are either in Greek or in Latin. And so you'd write out this complicated curse with the help of someone else maybe, or you could do it yourself if you knew how and had the materials. And then they would roll up this thing. This has been flattened out again, but they would roll them up into a tube and strike nails through them. And it wasn't really a voodoo-like thing. It was more an incantation. Apparently, the thinking is that they would say some spell or something as they're putting the nails into it. And then they would bury this. I know this is getting complicated, but nonetheless, we're almost there. They would bury this or place it near a grave. And the reason for that was that these curses were thought to be carried out by people in the underworld, gods or demons. And so if you put it near a grave, the spirit of that person who just died, especially good if it was a person who just died, it might be hanging around the grave there and might pick up your message and take it to the underworld where hopefully it would be carried on. So a number of these have been found in areas where they're supposed to have been graves. They also would often throw them in wells, which of course, if they'd known better, wouldn't have been a good idea because they're made of lead, right? So, but the idea was that at the bottom of the well, it's closer to the underworld and the message might get through. So I just think these are fascinating because number one, we don't do this anymore. I mean, there are very few. I think you can buy a curse kit on Etsy or something if you really want to, but there are very few people doing this lately. You can understand why. It's probably not a great impulse. It's not a nice thing to do, but it is true that these curses tended to draw the line at killing the other person. They did not do that. Some of them are kind of grisly, what they asked for to happen to the person that they were attacking. But they did not ask for them to die. That's a good thing. And I bet you that at least from a psychological point of view, whether anything happened or not after you completed your curse, they probably felt a lot better. They probably went away feeling better, and that's why it happened. I'm not recommending that we go back to this in any form, but I just find it fascinating. Okay, so I'm going to move on to Christian Europe. When the empire became Christian and Christianity sort of took over Europe. And so there were, as I mentioned to you, still people who would do augury, weather magic. There were people, I think tempestari is the Italian word for somebody who's supposed to have magical powers over the weather. Weather was really important. curses, and of course, very importantly, the witch craze started eventually in Europe and was a horrible thing that the churches did in order to boost their popularity primarily. That's the thinking. And of course, people who were accused of being witches were said to be superstitious and involved in bad things. Interestingly, the church typically did not deny that the street magicians had power, but what they claimed was that the street magicians used demons, that there were devils and demons involved in the magic that they did, whereas our Christian magic is demon-free, 100% demon-free. And later, of course, as I said, witches also were communing with demons and the devil, obviously, and that was the distinction that they made. And you know, the church typically did not claim to have magical powers. That was not part of their deal, but the populace believed that they did, and they did nothing to dissuade them of this belief. So the people began to believe that priests had special powers. The baptism is explicitly exorcism, getting out the devil. And so as a result, holy water was attributed to all sorts of magic powers to it. Consecrated salt, which was used in ceremonies, was also thought to have magical powers. And the host, you know, the wafer that people have at communion, it was also supposed to be magical. So people would steal these things from the church, and in some cases they had to lock the stuff up. And they would spread it on their grounds or their crops to see them grow or whatever. And so the church had its own magic, but it was demon-free magic. So you can still get some religious magic out there if you're interested. This is Jordan River holy water, which you can get on Amazon for $8.98. And at least the last time I looked, for 100 milliliters of it. Now, I don't think any church endorses this as being holy water, but because it came from the River Jordan, I mean, they say it came from the River Jordan. I don't know where it came from, but they say it came from the River Jordan, and therefore it's sort of holy in that respect. This is an even more popular one that I love. You know, you've probably heard of, but this Saint Joseph kit will cost you about, I think, $12 on Amazon and other places as well. It turns out that Saint Joseph is an excellent realtor. And if you bury him in your front yard, some people say that it should be buried upside down in, you know, somewhere in the vicinity of the real estate sign in your front yard. Then your house will just go like that. It'll sell the next day. And it comes with a little prayer card and a little cardboard box that it's all in, plastic Saint Joseph for 12 something or other. Anyway, so religious magic is still with us. Okay, so the Enlightenment comes and everything is better. Science starts to take over, and superstition starts to be, the word finally starts to be applied to beliefs that are not scientific. And so that's where we're, you know, supposedly where we are now. And so we can talk about that later. So we should define it. And there is no agreed upon, there's no like Congress that has decided what the definition of a superstition is. And I've used a fairly broad one. And so I would put it in the category of a belief or practice unsupported by science and that is goal directed, trying to get good luck or avoid bad luck. And so, you know, I have a little Venn diagram there with universal beliefs, paranormal beliefs, and I use ESP and ghosts. There are many others that you could use as an example, but these are beliefs that are not scientific, but they're not particularly goal directed. People, I mean, I know people have tried to harness ESP for some purpose, but that's generally not what's going on. And so superstitions are very goal directed, and so they fall into that subcategory. I also tend to myself believe that we should be culture fair about it. If a person comes from a culture that has not been exposed to or has not been indoctrinated into Western scientific thinking, then it's not realistic to think that they're going to behave in any other way. And so to call them superstitious seems to me unfair, unrealistic. Their beliefs and our practices to us are, but it, I don't know how they would ever come across a different way to think unless they're exposed to it. For a similar reason, I would let kids off the hook until they get to be old enough to, as I might say, know better. But young children are not really hip to the scientific method yet. And so later on, we can call them superstitious if they continue to not step on a crack when they're 21, then, it's another thing. Okay, so let's talk about some popular superstitions. Here's one. This is probably the most popular superstition, the fear of the number 13. There are three major theories as to where it came from. I'm not going to go into them tonight. They're in my book. Just to cut to the chase, I believe the one that has the greatest support is the Last Supper, with 13 people at a table being unlucky, and so on. It is still widely believed. This poll is a little out of date now, but I just love it because it is about people being placed on the 13th floor of a hotel. And wouldn't you know, 13% of people say they'd be bothered by it. And 9% said they'd be bothered enough to ask for a different room. So as a purely business savvy decision, you can see that people skip over the 13th floor. Let's just call it the 14th floor, and no one will be the wiser, we hope. I have written a fair amount actually in Skeptical Inquirer about superstition in real estate. It is the interface of superstition with the business world, with marketing and so forth, is worthy of study, and I've written a fair amount about it in the magazine. So for example, this article about Chinese real estate, the Feng Shui, I hope I spelled that correctly, is still a big thing in the Chinese market. And with the rise of the Chinese middle class and the economy in China, these are things that are starting to leak very heavily into the US. There are Feng Shui consultants that people can hire. And when Chinese people or other people from Asia come here, they are often concerned about the Feng Shui of the house and so forth. This has no science behind it whatsoever, but it's a thing. This is one of my favorite superstitions. I grew up in the Midwest of the United States and was, completely unaware of this. I'd written the first book on superstition already, and I never had heard of the evil eye until a student mentioned it to me. And it turns out that it's widely believed in big parts of the globe, South Asia, the Middle East, European continent, and South America. And it's a more complicated superstition. It's envy-based. The idea is that somebody who is envious of you may want to harm you. And if they have, quote, have the evil eye, they can do it simply by looking, like waves or something come out of the eye. And it's a real thing. And babies, because they're so precious, are often a target of the evil eye. And so then there's this whole market of objects that can be used as countermeasures against it. On the left, you have the blue glass Turkish Nazar, which has an eye shape in the middle of it. And on the right, far right, you have the Hamsa, which is popular in the Middle East. They both have eye shapes. And part of the purpose of that is, one, to distract the evil eye over to the jewelry or to the amulet. Sometimes these are hung on the wall. I have the Turkish Nazar hanging in my kitchen. And the distract the eye away, but also in some cases to reflect the waves back at the attacker and harm them instead. This horn thing is the Italian version of the distraction for malocchio, as they call it in Italy. And there's a whole complicated thing in Italy about some people do a test. If you think you're sick and that it was brought on by the evil eye, then there's this oil and water test where you put drops of oil in a bowl of water, and if the drops remain separated, you're good. But if they're runny, it was the evil eye, and so forth. I'm very scientific, of course. Other complicated systems, astrology, I definitely put in the category of a superstition. People do follow their horoscope and make plans on it, of course. And it's, if anything, it's on the rise. The thought is that the young generation here in the U.S. is much more less religious than their parents, and as a result, they still need something spiritual. And so they are spiritual. And so they are going to astrology and other things like this. Of course, it's also related to the fact that young people are really good at apps and the internet and their phones. And if you go to the iPhone app store and just type in the word astrology, you'll find page after page of apps wanting to serve you in a celestial sort of way. On the right, you have homeopathic medicine. So that's what that's supposed to represent. Homeopathy is a completely debunked medical treatment, even though it's been around since the 19th century, but it is still very popular today. The royal family in England likes it a lot, or has in the past. And as some of you know, the Center for Inquiry has sued CVS and some other drugstores for displaying homeopathic medicines in the same sort of vein as if they were real medicine, right next to real medicines, in a way that is very, very, we believe, very unfair and potentially dangerous for people who think it's actually a real medicine. It's not. They're all placebos, which is actually a good thing, because some of the medicines that they use are poisons. You know, deadly nightshade is a homeopathic medicine. Thankfully, it's so diluted in the bottles that it can't hurt you. But, you know, people believe they're buying real medicine when they buy them. Oh, I happened to be, I had the privilege of being in Paris 2 weeks ago for an actual in live conference, my first since the pandemic started. And I went to Père Lachaise Cemetery, which is most famous for having Jim Morrison's grave there. And but up the hill from Jim, a ways away, is this enormous monument to Samuel Hahnemann. He is buried there. His wife is buried there too. Samuel Hahnemann was the inventor and popularizer of homeopathic medicine. So you can see that he was, at least at the time of his death, considered to be quite the thing. We're trying to dissuade people from his medicine. Okay, so up to now, I've been talking a lot about superstitions that are sort of socially shared, that you would learn them from your parents or through the cultural knowledge that you acquire just in being alive. But people, there's a whole other category of superstitions that people have that are personal superstitions that they acquire sort of through trial and error on their own, and they use only themselves. It's not like they try to get other people to do it, and so on. And so here are a couple of examples of that. This is on the left, of course, is Taylor Swift, and I've written about this briefly before, but she was born on December 13th, and she considers the number 13 to be her lucky number. Her Twitter handle is Taylor Swift 13, and she used to write the number 13 on her hand when she did performances, as this suggests. I don't think there's any evidence that it's lucky for her either. You know, it's neither lucky or unlucky, but I kind of feel as though she's done a service in demystifying a scary superstition to some degree. And it's not exactly what we would want, but it's better than fearing the number 13. I personally believe that all of the fear-based superstitions like black cats, ladders, the number 13, we would all have been much better off if no one had taught them to us. I know why they did it, right? In the old days, they needed to have explanations for bad things that happened. And so they came up with these unusual, explanations. But now that we all know them, it's just not a great thing to suddenly recognize that you're sitting in the 13th row of an airplane that you're just about to get on or whatever. If you're a believer. If you're not a believer, it's not a big deal. But anyway, that's Taylor Swift. On the right, you may recognize Barack Obama. And Barack Obama has an unusual superstition, which is an election day superstition that he feels as though he has to organize a pickup basketball game on a day that he's on the ballot for an election. Obviously, he won't be doing this in the future, but probably. He did do it on both of his campaigns, and there's a whole story about it in his new autobiography as to how he developed the superstition. And to his credit, he calls it a superstition. He admits that it is a superstition. The guy in the bottom, if you're a tennis fan, you may recognize Rafael Nadal, who's really superstitious. He goes through this long, pulling at a shirt thing when he's serving, and he has rituals that go on for minutes and minutes, sometimes delaying games and getting him into trouble with penalties and so on, irritating fans. Right there in that picture, he's very carefully organizing 2 water bottles, one of which is filled with cold water and the other one is room temperature water. This is just part of his many, many things. But unlike Barack Obama, he does not admit to being superstitious. He claims it's just a ritual. He's not superstitious. I'll let you decide whether that's true or not. Okay, some psychology. You may be getting an idea of the psychology behind it. Why do people believe? I think it's really important to recognize the role of socialization, that people learn these things from their parents, from people around them. And if their parents are believers and model that kind of behavior, then they are likely to become believers, just like anything else that we learn growing up. And so socialization and just absorbing cultural knowledge and family knowledge is an important aspect of it. Once you know the superstition, or once superstition is an open possibility for you, then the psychological factors are anxiety. That superstitions tend to come up in situations where we are tense. There's something important that we want to happen, and we can't guarantee it. We can't. It's not 100% sure that it's going to happen, and so we're likely to become anxious at that point. And so it is a way of coping with anxiety. People say they feel better if they do the superstition. It also provides an illusion of control. The idea that you're doing something, even though it can't be connected to the outcome you're looking for, there's no real way for that to be the case. You feel as though you have greater control. You're doing something to bring around the outcome. And so psychologists refer to this as the illusion of control. And control and anxiety are very much connected. If you're out of control, if you have no control, that's likely to be an anxious circumstance for you. I also want to, I've written some stuff about economics also, and I think that this is also an overlooked aspect of this that we really need to look at. And that is that there is a profit motive for many of these things to sustain them rather than to drop them. And so astrology is a very big money-making business. It's been described as being $1 billion business in India, where it's all done online. And the evil eye jewelry has become very fashionable. Meghan Markle has been spotted wearing Turkish Nazar jewelry. It's a thing. The growing impact of the Chinese in the marketplace is likely to promote this also. Chinese people have a number of traditional superstitions that show up, are visible in the marketplace. And so the number 4 is considered unlucky because when spoken, it sounds like the word for death. And the number 8 is considered lucky because when spoken, it sounds like the word for prosper or prosperous. And the color red is also considered to be lucky. So in the marketplace, you see evidence of this all the time. This picture on the right is of a sushi place in New Jersey. Those of you who know your area codes can figure that out. But take a look at the last 4 numbers, 888, right? This is a kind of signal to a certain customer that you dial that number, this is a lucky number. And so you're going to see evidence of this kind of thing, as well as Feng Shui and everything else, as the Chinese become bigger buyers in the global marketplace. Homeopathy also is an example of something that has a profit motive. People are making money off of it. And these things are challenges for those of us who would like to see less of this in the world. another aspect of the psychology, and I'm coming to the end, so don't be worried. The an interesting aspect from the point of view of a psychologist myself is that there is a group of people who are conflicted about this. They know that superstition is silly, but they say quite openly, I'll just feel better if I do this. I know it can't, it's crazy, but I'll just feel better if I do that. I think that's a real, they're expressing something real. There was a case some years ago that I describe in my book of a chain letter. Many people on this call are probably too young to remember what chain letters were, but the idea was that you would get a chain letter. Often there was no return address on it out of embarrassment. And the letter would say that if you make 10 copies of this letter within a certain number of hours and send them off to 10 of your friends, then you will have great luck and you will avoid, horrible calamities. One of the ones that was most influential to people was that if you didn't do it, you would have expensive car repairs. Anyway, this came through the journalistic world at some point. And so journalists always looking for material wrote an article about it. And one of the people interviewed in that article said, look, I know this is crazy, but I'll just feel better if I copy these letters and send them off, and I won't have to worry about that anymore. And this is, I think, a human thing that is related to what is known as the dual process model of cognition. If any of you have read Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, he talks about the slow system 1, it's called, which is very intuitive and not so logical, emotional. And then system 2 is the logical system that can do computation, that is rational, that can work things out. And sometimes these two systems are working at the same time and in conflict with each other. And I think that's exactly what is going on in the case of these people who say that. I would say, and this is a judgment, but I would say that we don't really have to worry about these people. They may be engaging in some superstitions, but when push comes to shove, I'm confident that these people are going to get the vaccine, are going to go to their doctors, are going to do the scientific thing when it matters. And so that doesn't bother me. And so that leads me into this little sort of classification scheme that I came up with in the book. And this is just me, and I don't know that anyone else will agree, but I think that there are at least 3 categories of people with respect to superstition, belief in superstition. Skeptics, who, for whom superstition is just not a real option. It doesn't enter their thinking at all. It doesn't affect their lives, and it would never come up. I'm sure that there are many, listening right now. The conflicted, as I mentioned, there may be a few of you out there that fall into this category, but the conflicted who know better, but they have a tug that makes them want to do it. That's the second category. The last category is obviously the true believers, the ones for whom not being superstitious is not some option, that they believe it fully, that they think that they have the truth, that it's based in a false belief and a non-scientific belief. And my belief is these are the ones we have to be worried about. And unfortunately, I think there are more of them around today than there were, shall we say, 6 years ago. So on that cheery note, I'll stop talking and say thank you.
Stuart, that was awesome. Oh my goodness. We have questions, but I have so many comments. But my first is, again, thank you for this. And I feel seen. Sort of based on a couple of things that you mentioned, I feel that I might be culturally superstitious. I wouldn't put on my little red, for luck while you were talking. But I actually had an incident happen many years ago. A wedding picture of one of my good friends, her and her husband. Their wedding photo was on my refrigerator. It fell off one day. Now I'm sure the glue on the magnet, the logic, yeah, that's what happened. But when the picture fell, I was like, uh-oh, are they okay?
Did you call them?
Well, yes, I did. And here's why, because we are both children of West Indian descent. Our grandparents are from the Caribbean, and that we are logical, educated, women, but that family thing popped up. Like my grandmother would have thought, yeah, something happened. So I called her and I said, Janine, listen, I don't believe in this. but I had to call you. And she goes, when I told her what happened, she goes, yes, you did have to call me. She goes, we're fine. But she understood that impulse. I felt ridiculous, but we were both like, oh, we're trapped in this thing that we have to do. Cause it again, it's something we learned from our family.
Exactly.
So yikes. But you said right up top, if anybody has any meteorite dust, and I don't know how strict you are on that requirement, because I just have regular dust, so I don't know if that will.
I've got plenty of that, unfortunately.
Oh, okay, all right. So you're set. You're set. And I really do. There were a couple of things that stood out, but really it was that people were elaborate in writing out their curses. It's almost like a curse vision board. Like you're putting up pictures and writing what you want to happen to that person. I do think it's a good way of sort of expunging that feeling, and then not following through. It's like bad journaling or good journaling, however you look at it.
Yes.
But wow. Okay, we have so many questions coming in, and I have to say I really enjoyed this because I think this cuts across education, class, gender, culture. I mean, because everybody's got their thing that they might do or have heard of, or they've seen someone do, whether or not they believe in it or not. And Chad had the best first question. Thank you, Chad Davis. What is the most outrageous, and I think that's a subjective question, clearly. What is the most outrageous superstition you've come across?
Okay, well, there are a lot of them. And I hope that you've either already eaten or you have a strong stomach. So he asked he went there, right? So so I had a friend in college who and this is in the book, in the first book, that believed sort of in a voodoo sort of way that people who got a hold of the nail clippings of his family or himself could do harm, right?
Yes.
And so he asked his family members to give him their nail clippings, and he kept them in a little jar. And he was an English graduate student that I knew. And at night when he was reading, he would pull from this container and chew up and swallow, so he claimed that no one else would get at the thing. Now, it raised first of all, it's disgusting. Secondly, it raised the question. He didn't mention anything about hair clippings. Like, are you going to eat those too? But I don't know. But anyway, that's up there in the most, the most outrageous. They haven't been able to top
that is up there. So, honestly, I think just eat the potato chips. Just stop trying to count the calories. And I contacted him.
I'm sorry. I contacted him about 20 years later, and he said he was still doing it, but his kids wouldn't give him their nails anymore. He just had to do it with his own.
Wow.
I know.
Wow. Okay. No, I have a friend who's similar. When she gets her hair cut, she doesn't leave her hair at the salon. She takes it with her because if somebody got a hold of it, they could then put a curse on her, or it would enhance the evil eye. I mean, and I didn't even bother trying to talk her out of it. Just take your hair home, girl. Juanita Baker wanted to know, and I have this question as well. What about augury and the birds? Like, how did they interpret the flights? Like, what did that mean?
I don't know how it was done, but and there were probably systems that were written, but they somehow, if the birds did a certain thing, it foretold some aspect of it. It's sort of like I don't know how the system worked, and I don't know that we have any written documents that explain exactly how it was done. I mean, we have better knowledge when it comes to dreams, right? I mentioned the prophesying from dreams. there are famous dream books, the Egyptian books that explained what the meanings of various things foretold and so forth in dreams. But my guess is that it was that some kind of lore, and it, remember that we're dealing with independent practitioners, right? They may have had their own view of what the birds were doing and what it meant, but there wasn't, as far as I know, I have not heard about a system like that everybody used. But there was some way in which this random flight of birds was interpreted to mean something.
Okay. We have a couple of people who are asking, and this is interesting, if OCD is in any way based in superstition.
Yeah, I have a whole chapter on that in the Believing in Magic book, and
Huh.
OCD is the disorder that looks the most like superstition. It involves compulsive rituals and obsessive thoughts, and so it has that look, and it's also anxiety based, in the same way that superstition is. However, I think the thinking is that although they look the same and may have similar sources, that they're just like not the same thing. That OCD is a rare disorder. It's much more severe and it's quite debilitating. People, I interviewed a guy who had obsessive compulsive disorder for the book, the original book. He was quite interested in superstition too. And he said, I've never experienced it as a positive thing. I wish I could stop, but I can't. And whereas people who are superstitious, I think it has a different role for them. And there hasn't been any evidence that, like, if you're superstitious as a kid, you grow up to be obsessive compulsive as a grown up. So far, I don't think there's any real connection there that people have been able to find. So, but it's an obvious and reasonable question because they look so similar in the things that they do.
Thank you. That is very interesting. Another question that folks are asking is belief in God a superstition?
I wonder why that would come up. Yeah, I
Oh,
mean,
I should have led with that. What?
yeah, I mean that I do deal with that in the book, and this is in this audience, what I'm about to say may be more controversial than it would be in other audiences, or it would be controversial in a different way there. But so my definition is that it's a pragmatic belief that is non-scientific, right? The mere belief that there is a God is not necessarily, it could be seen as a non-scientific belief perhaps, but it's also a non-testable belief. And so it's not one of those things where we can come up with a test that says whatever. So I tend to be, if the idea is that a person believes in just the mere existence of some entity, of course, it's always defined in such a way that we can't touch it or measure it in any real way. Then I don't know what to say about that. I wouldn't call it a superstition. It's not a belief that I would want or have, but a superstition tends to be a claim about the natural world, right? That doing X will cause this to happen, right? Okay. And that's a testable claim. And to me that, typically they don't hold up to science, and that's what I would call a superstition. So there are plenty of religious beliefs that I do call superstitious. So for example, people believing that you can heal with prayer, right? Or the laying on of hands, or or the St. Joseph medal, right? All those things are religious beliefs that I think are superstitious because they're making claims about the natural world that I believe are not valid, that are not tested, not demonstrated. And so that's the way I think about it. But certain religious beliefs are sort of off the grid, and you can believe them if you want, quote, on faith, and many of us on this call probably would choose not to, but I wouldn't call it a superstition.
Okay. I, for one, there is a dragon in my garage. He just won't let me take his measurements. Exactly. every time I open the door, poof, he goes away. So like Mr. Snuffleupagus. Jim Elder asks a good question, which I think we already know the answer, but I would love your take on it. Is social media increasing beliefs in superstition?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think so. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, the emotional pull of social media is so strong. And we're seeing the evidence of that now, that people are willing to believe things that, as long as they fit with their own, politics or their own other belief systems, they will latch onto them because it feels really good, and they get likes and they give likes. And so there's no question about that. It is, there are many positive things about social media and about the internet, but this is one of the drawbacks.
Yes, I would say that, and it is constantly trying to sell me shapewear in my
Yeah.
Instagram timeline. But I'm trying not to take that
Yeah.
personally. We all have a COVID-19 situation going on. Well, not all of us. Um, okay, we have a cool question. What role might trauma and or vulnerability in one, wait a minute, what role might trauma and or vulnerability play in one's superstitious beliefs?
So that's a really good question. I don't think I've ever been asked this exact question, but here's my answer. To the extent that it increases your sort of free floating level of anxiety in your life, right? If you are a superstitious person in any way, it's likely to increase you're going to feel less in control, more fearful in certain situations. And so my instinct would be to say that it's likely to increase your reliance on superstition. And it would be a challenge for anyone, of course, whether they're superstitious or not. But the superstitious person is going to grasp for that as a way of coping with anxiety. There's no question that that is the basis of much superstition, and
Mm.
so that's my guess.
Well,
Interesting question.
yeah, no, Stuart, we are right at the hour. But if you will indulge me to ask one more that several folks are asking, and
Sure.
it is, do you think that there are positive aspects of superstition? For example, I think it's Rafael Nadal. I'm not a
Yes.
sport. Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. His rituals help him
Tennis
play
player.
better by putting him in a better mental state, as you mentioned. If so, how would you balance those against the negative aspects?
Right. Good. Very good question. And so there is actually some research to back this up, what I'm about to say. And unfortunately, the answer is kind of muddled.
Okay.
What is being at, and this way science is sometimes, but it makes sense that if it's obvious that superstitions have a psychological benefit, that they make people feel better. They give them this illusion of control. It's a way of coping with anxiety. The question that for many years was not dealt with was the issue of, does that then lead to better performance? And particularly it's not going to
Mm,
be better performance on the roulette table, right?
no.
But in a skilled activity like playing tennis or performing a stand-up routine, or any kind of activity where there's skill involved, could it help? There was a famous golf ball study that people may have heard about that was done in Germany, which suggested that people who believed in luck could putt a golf ball better. And so it seemed to show that this actually worked, right? And it was a controlled study. Unfortunately, it came just at the beginning of the replication crisis in psychology. And because it got a lot of publicity, somebody tried to replicate it in the US with far more subjects, a much more controlled study. And sadly, no luck effect, no difference
Mm,
between here's your lucky ball and here's your ball, right? And so we don't know. I mean, as I say,
okay.
I don't think the evidence is strong. I think that people do it just to feel better, and the period
Yeah.
before a tennis match and during a tennis match when you're not playing is an anxious period. So that's probably the justification. I would like to think that there are better ways to do that, but it's also not, and these are not, tremendously harmful,
Right.
situations. If, there are other false beliefs out there that are much more dangerous at the moment.
For sure. I am going to cuddle up and review with my lucky black cat all of this and see what he thinks. But Stuart, thank you so much. This was so entertaining and so informational and so good. Thank you so much. And I just want to remind the audience that if you missed anything, the recording of this will be available tomorrow, I believe, at skepticalinquirer.com. And please join us on July 22nd. Mike Rothschild, the author of The Storm is Upon Us, will explain the background of the conspiracies and cults that led to the Q phenomenon. And so we are at the end. I want to extend my thanks to Skeptical Inquirer, to the Center for Inquiry, to our producer, Mark Kreidler. He is the best. And to you, the audience, for spending your evening with us. And again, to you, Stuart, thank you so much for that. My
My
name
pleasure.
is Leanne Lord. Thank you and good night. Good night, Stuart.
Good night.